This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and in the early hours of Friday the 21st of December, these are our main stories. The US and UK say hackers linked to the Chinese government have stolen confidential data from government agencies and companies in at least 12 countries. British police have asked for help from the army to deal with drones, which have forced the closure of Gatwick, the country's second biggest airport. Protests over the rising price of bread and fuel are spreading in Sudan. In one town, 6 demonstrators have been killed. Also in this podcast,
overall, I made €16,000. That would be a valid amount. For the Christmas break, I expect per week to make $2,000 at the minimum.
We report on how hackers are making a fortune from a highly successful video game. China has been accused of running a decade-long hacking campaign against commercial and military targets in the US, Europe and Asia. The US Justice Department said it had indicted 2 men affiliated to China's main intelligence agency, accusing them of hacking into the computer networks of some 50 companies in at least a dozen countries. It hasn't disclosed which global companies have been affected. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
The US and UK say that a group of hackers linked to Chinese intelligence ran one of the most significant and widespread cyber campaigns, reaching across at least a dozen countries and resulting in real economic damage. They say the group targeted IT service providers in order to steal confidential business information from their corporate clients, like designs and trade secrets. The director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, outlined the case in Washington as indictments were issued against 2 Chinese individuals.
Healthy competition is good for the global economy. Criminal conduct is not. Rampant theft is not. Cheating is not. There is no light on this issue between the United States and our law-abiding international partners. We're all standing shoulder to shoulder to condemn this conduct.
The US has been increasingly vocal about Chinese economic espionage in recent months, but this is the first time the UK has joined Washington in making such an accusation. These activities must stop, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt said in a statement, and it's understood that concerns had already been raised with Beijing in private, including by the Prime Minister. UK officials, though, have been reluctant to get involved in a standoff with China in the same way as the Trump administration. Officials could not specify what action would be taken beyond the issuing of a statement and said that they thought the overall relationship between the UK and China was strong enough to withstand today's public accusation.
Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera. One of Europe's busiest airports has ground to a halt caused by a deliberate drone attack. The British Army has been deployed to Gatwick Airport south of London to try to locate a drone that flew several times above the runway. All flights have been grounded, causing chaos for more than 100,000 passengers travelling in the run-up to Christmas. Here's the British Defence Secretary, Gavin Williamson.
The armed forces have a range of unique capabilities, and this isn't something that we'd usually deploy, but we are there to assist and do everything we can so that they're in a position to be able to open the airport at the earliest possible opportunity.
The authorities say the airport won't resume flights until Friday morning. One of the passengers affected is this little boy, Teddy Stewart, who was due to fly to Lapland to meet Father Christmas.
My dad, he walked to the front desk of the airport and he asked what was going on, and the lady gave him a letter and it said that the sort of flights would be cancelled. I was just sad and upset.
The airport authorities are warning that the effects of the disruption could last for several days. So could this happen in other countries? Juliette Kayyem worked in the United States Department for Homeland Security under President Obama.
Anti-drone capability is really good at some sort of major event. Think about a football or a soccer event where you have a limited amount of time in which you're just trying to protect an airspace. Those kinds of devices would require so much investment on the security side to ensure that they're 24/7 manned, that you would know what to do if a drone came into airspace, most airports simply are taking a somewhat realistic risk analysis and saying this isn't happening that often, and it's a really expensive investment in safety and security.
But what happens if a drone hits a plane? Nuala McGovern asked Matt Whitfield, now a commercial pilot and a former naval fighter pilot.
A small drone, so up to 7 kilograms, could easily penetrate the leading edge of a wing, could glance off the fuselage, of course, or indeed penetrate the front end of the fuselage. And of course, there's always the risk that the drone might be ingested into the intake of one of the jet engines. But the good news is, of course, us professionally trained pilots are well used, well practiced to dealing with issues with our engines should we end up with one engine inoperative.
What would you say are the solutions?
Clearly, a change or an adjustment to the rules and regulations are of little use, because a new rule to someone who does not follow rules is not going to have an effect. So we're inevitably going to end up relying on the technology. Now, there's two parts to this, Nuala. The GPS signal, the global positioning signal that can be used to fly these drones with. They're very, very, very capable machines. But of course, you are capable of flying these drones without the need for GPS. And that relies, just as you and I might have done when we were young, flying a remote-controlled aeroplane, driving a car or a remote-controlled boat, it relies on the signal between your handset, the controller, between that controller and the aircraft. And right now, these drones use the Wi-Fi signal. So how are we going to counter that? Well, the question is, you need to be able to jam that signal. Can you see you can't just go jamming the Wi-Fi signal when anyone at the airport, including the emergency services, the airline operators, the operational side of an airport, relies on the Wi-Fi signal. It is not unusual to use birds of prey. The Naval Air Station at Yeovilton is very proud of its bird unit that was capable of scaring birds away. But of course, it's a different matter asking an animal, a beautiful bird of prey, to go after a drone. Can you train them? Of course you can. Is that a solution? It may well be. I don't agree with bullets, of course. We only have to talk to our Olympic champion, the clay pigeon shooter, how tricky it is just blowing a clay pigeon out of the sky, let alone a drone that's the size, let's say, of a laptop or bigger, travelling at 40 miles an hour and clearly at a range of up to 1,500 metres. You know, you've very little chance of shooting these things down. That would not be a particularly useful solution.
Pilot Matt Whitfield. 2 days of protests over the rising cost of bread and fuel have spread to the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. Witnesses said police fired tear gas at protesters close to the presidential palace. Earlier, police intervened to disperse similar protests in several other towns across the country, and a curfew has been imposed in the town of Gedarif. Our Africa editor Will Ross reports.
Security forces in civilian clothes firing on the streets of Gedarif in the east of Sudan. One young protester was killed and dozens of others were injured there. Crowds have also taken to the streets of at least 6 other towns, including Sennar in the south and Dongola in the north. The anger is aimed at the government. 2 offices of the governing National Congress Party have been set ablaze. Several hundred protesters also took to the streets of the capital, Khartoum, calling for the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir's government. They were quickly dispersed by the police using tear gas. The 2 days of protest do not appear to have been led by any politicians, but began early on Wednesday when young students in the town of Atbara in the north of the country found the cost of their breakfast had doubled overnight. The Sudanese government has long subsidised the price of bread as well as fuel, but it plans to remove some of those subsidies. The country's economy has been in decline ever since South Sudan broke away, taking with it most of the oil. And these days the banks have had to impose limits on how much money people can withdraw. When the Sudanese pound was devalued in September, the cost of importing wheat shot up, and there have also been shortages of bread. Perhaps most worrying of all for President Bashir is the fact that in some areas the army is not intervening and even appears to be siding with the protesters.
Will Ross. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the long-delayed presidential election due on Sunday has been put back another week. It's the latest in a series of delays that have frustrated opposition supporters and deepened their suspicion that President Joseph Kabila intends to cling on to power. The president has been in office since 2001. Our correspondent in the capital, Kinshasa, Louise Douast, reports.
For weeks now, candidates on both sides have said that they would not accept another delay. The Electoral Commission says it suffered a serious blow after a fire destroyed a lot of its electoral material. And so they had to order 5 million more ballot papers, many of which have not yet arrived. This announcement is likely to trigger violence. Polls have shown that a large number of Congolese people do not want further delays. Officially, the Electoral Commission is asking for 7 more days to organise these elections, for this vote to happen on December 30th. But a number of people in the country will see this decision as another excuse not to have these elections.
Louise Debast in Kinshasa. Now to Spain, where a hunger strike by 4 imprisoned pro-independence figures in Catalonia has come to an end. The men refused food for between 17 and 20 days in protest at the handling of their cases by the Spanish courts. This report by Neil Gallagher.
9 Catalan leaders are in jail, accused of rebellion for their part in last year's push for independence from Spain. So far, there's been no trial. That's expected to begin in the new year. 2 of them began a hunger strike on the 1st of December, joined by 2 others later that week. They accused the Spanish courts of delaying processing their cases and therefore stopping them taking them to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Writing to me from prison, one of the hunger strikers, Jordi Sanchez, said he didn't expect justice in Spain. His words are spoken by an actor.
Hores d'ara no m'ho crec. Right now, I don't believe so. Everyone has seen that the judges have been chosen by the political parties to control the trial and impose the verdict they want. Despite everything, they haven't accepted the defense we have made. There's nothing more to say. It will be a trial with political aims. Amb objectius polítics.
The decision to end the strike was taken after Spain's highest court threw out a bail appeal by Mr Sanchez, who's been in prison since October last year. He now intends to take his case to the Strasbourg court. The former Speaker of the Catalan Parliament, Carme Forcadell, became the first pro-independence prisoner to petition the court this week. If convicted in Spain, they face jail terms of up to 25 years. Others, including former President Carles Puigdemont, remain outside Spain and face arrest if they return.
That report by Neil O'Gallagher. And now to Mars. And that's the sound of wind on the red planet picked up a few weeks ago by a seismometer carried by NASA's InSight mission. Now that seismometer has been planted on the planet's surface to measure Mars quakes. Our science correspondent Jonathan Amos told me more.
This really is the primary mission here for InSight, which you remember landed on Mars back in November. It's going to put these seismometers, they come from France and from Britain, and they will listen very, very carefully, intently, to any vibrations in the ground which will come from earthquakes, or being Mars, they must be Mars quakes, obviously. They will do that, and that will help them discern something of the internal structure of the planet. Now, we know very well what the inside of the Earth looks like because we use seismometers here. Every time you get an earthquake, it's kind of like a flashbulb going off, and you can imagine the seismometer is like a camera. And every time you get that quake, then you get a little glimpse of what's under your feet. And so that's what they're going to be doing over the course of the next 2 Earth years, is waiting for these little quakes to go off, and then hopefully finding out, where the core is, where the mantle, the bit in the middle between the crust and the core is, where they start, where they stop. And that'll allow them then to compare and contrast with Earth. And that'll tell us something of the different histories of the planets, because they must have started off pretty much the same, but they've taken different courses during geological history. Earth is warm and cuddly and wet. Mars is very dry and cold and not cuddly at all.
So you say that will tell us a lot about what's happening. I mean, how big a deal is this whole experiment?
Well, we've gone to Mars because we want to know if there is life elsewhere in the solar system, beyond Earth. And if you look at the Earth today, it's pretty clear that life and the way that life is able to thrive is tied up with the internal dynamics of the planet. Let me just give you a very quick example. We have a core, an outer core that basically moves. It's liquid iron and a little bit of nickel. And from that you get a global magnetic field that protects life on Earth from hazardous radiation from space. Now, when we look at Mars, we see evidence in the rocks that it once had a global magnetic field, but now it doesn't. And we'd like to know when that happened. And if we get some idea of how big the core is on Mars, we can answer that question. And then we can think about, well, did life have a chance to get going on Mars?
Jonathan Amos reporting. Still to come in this podcast, the US finally enacts legislation to outlaw lynching, the murder by white mobs of thousands of African Americans, mainly in the 19th and 20th centuries. While we've been on air, the US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis said he's resigning a day after President Trump announced he was withdrawing US troops from Syria. In his resignation letter, General Mattis said the president had the right to have a defense chief whose views were more aligned with his own. Mr. Trump said the general would leave his job in February. The president's announcement on Syria came despite opposition from US allies and military officials. A court in New York has refused to dismiss criminal charges of sexual assault against the Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein. His lawyers had argued that the case had been tainted by the conduct of the police and prosecutors, but the judge said there was no basis for that claim. Harvey Weinstein, who denies all allegations of non-consensual sex, is facing 5 counts of assault against 2 women, including of rape. Our correspondent Nick Bryant was outside the court in Manhattan.
The defence team has been trying for months to have the case against Harvey Weinstein dismissed. Its claimed prosecutors kept key information from the grand jury that indicted him, including emails between the disgraced movie mogul and his accusers. In October, Judge James Burke dismissed one of the charges against Mr. Weinstein because a lead detective was deemed to have withheld exculpatory evidence. But in a courtroom crowded with campaigners from the Time's Up movement, including the Oscar-winning actress Marissa Tomei, the judge ruled the case should continue heading for trial. There was no basis for the defendant's claim of law enforcement misconduct in the proceedings, he ruled, adding that the charges presented in the grand jury were supported by competent evidence. This is a major legal blow for Harvey Weinstein, who has been accused of inappropriate behaviour, including rape, by more than 80 women stretching back over decades. He denies all the allegations.
The judge's decision was welcomed by the Time's Up movement, which campaigns against sexual harassment. Its president is Lisa Borders.
Today, here in New York, we saw the first steps toward justice. Together, we stand in solidarity with all survivors everywhere. Frankly, we are relieved that Harvey Weinstein failed in his efforts to avoid accountability for his actions, and we are very happy that none of the charges were dismissed.
Time Up's Lisa Borders. Most parents like to know what their children get up to in the classroom, but usually have to depend on reports from teachers or from the youngsters themselves. Now, some schools in China are providing instant feedback by using a device called an intelligent uniform to monitor a pupil's attendance and behaviour. When worn, the technology records data about the student and automatically sends it to parents and teachers. Our China analyst Kerry Allen told me more.
Well, they've got inbuilt sensors into the collars, and the sensors connect with areas around the school, normally at the entrance of the school building, the classrooms, so that parents and teachers can see via a mobile app whether students have been coming to class on time. But also beyond this, these uniforms that have been around for quite a bit now, but they're being further promoted today, they can send out a voice alarm if a student's not paying attention or their attention seems to be dropping in class. And also if a child tries to tamper with the device and tries to change it. So they're very sophisticated pieces of clothing. And apparently there are already 2 areas in China, 2 big areas, where these have been rolled out in over 10 schools. They've been very successful with parents and with teachers, and they're hoping to extend this further to more schools around the country.
A lot of people would say this is an observation, this is a control. I mean, why are they doing it?
Well, they're saying they're doing it because over 200,000 students actually go missing every year. They're saying that in primary schools in particular, this is a problem. So it's a way of monitoring students for their own safety. But this has been a concern that one newspaper, Global Times, raises, that these devices, they can actually, technically a parent or a teacher could track a student outside of school hours, so they could find out if they're going anywhere, where they are. They seem to have inbuilt location devices, so they are quite daunting, and it could mean basically a tracking device on a child.
And what has been reaction to them? You say lots of parents like them.
Well, this is what media is saying, but actually there's no social media discussion about this whatsoever. There have been these reports for a while now about these intelligent uniforms coming, but there's been very little reaction online to no reaction whatsoever. All that has been official media saying that these are a good idea and they're being very well received. But there's no indication that there's been any uptake for this whatsoever.
And I suppose if they use it for students, they could use it for anyone. They could use it for workers.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And there have been articles in tech media about devices like this being used in sportswear, for example, so that people can, they don't have to wear watches or apps that could sync to their phones. They could just wear clothing for their level. And it's part of this whole extension of what you wear could tell you so much about your body and your experiences that where does it end?
Well, and also it tells other people what you're doing.
Exactly, yes. Very frightening.
Kerry Allen there. Over the last 100 years, more than 200 anti-lynching bills have been introduced in the United States Congress, and they've all been voted down. Now, a move to outlaw the killings by white mobs of thousands of African Americans has been unanimously approved. It will make lynching, carried out throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in the country, a federal crime in America. The bill was introduced in June by the only 3 black members of the US Senate, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, both Democrats, and the Republican Tim Scott. So, why has it taken so long for this legislation to pass? Tim Franks asked Joshua Guild, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Princeton University.
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One reason, of course, is historical in terms of the balance of power in between the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And at the time that lynching was at its highest point, in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, the Democratic Party controlled the South, and that was the party of the Confederacy. And so there was certainly not in their interest to allow legislation to go forward, federal legislation that would provide sort of the impetus for the federal government to oversee or to their perspective, to intervene in the affairs of the various southern states. Now we're in a different moment. This is part of the question that's sort of raised by why this legislation gets passed now, or sort of passed in the Senate. I think we can think of this period as a kind of conjuncture, to use a term that the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall would use, right? It was a time when sort of different things are happening at once, or coming together. On the one hand, this is a period in the United States of great nostalgia and remembrance. We're looking back at the civil rights era. We're a number of 50th anniversaries. This year is the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. A few years ago, the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and so forth. We also are in a moment of the potent Black Lives Matter movement. And then we have the sort of unsettled legacy of Obama on the one hand, followed by the sort of unsettling reality of Trump on the other. And so these things have all sort of come together to, I think, produce this moment in which this legislation could pass.
Does it have, I'm sure it has symbolic value, but does it have anything beyond symbolic value?
That's very hard to say. I mean, I certainly see it primarily as a symbolic act by the Senate. In 2005, the Senate passed an official apology that passed 90 senators signed on to that measure, apologizing to the victims of lynching, but also apologizing for the Senate's own inaction on anti-lynching legislation over the period of nearly 100 years. And this recent bill that just passed actually reproduces the text of that 2005 apology and then adds some more additional language. And so it remains to be seen, though, to what extent this would actually be invoked and applied should it pass the House of Representatives and be signed into law by President Trump, neither one of which, we should take for granted as necessary to happen. In particular, I'm most curious, having sort of read the text of the legislation, whether we can envision a time in which this legislation, this sort of new hate crime designation for lynching, would be applied to law enforcement officers. And there's nothing in the history of the country, evidence or of its recent past to suggest that would take place, but that would be a point where we could see some substance put onto this.
Professor Joshua Geld of Princeton University. The video game Fortnite has recently launched its 7th season and now boasts more than 200 million players worldwide. But a BBC investigation has found that hackers take advantage of that popularity by stealing private account details to sell on to a thriving online marketplace. Hackers as young as 14 are able to earn thousands of dollars every week, and the UK's National Crime Agency is asking the games maker to do more to stop the burgeoning black market. Here's our cyber security reporter Joe Tidy.
Since Fortnite exploded onto the scene, it's become the world's most popular video game, with 200 million players worldwide. But it's also probably the most popular video game with hackers. Many of them, who are teenagers, are exploiting it like it's a full-time job, making thousands of pounds a week. The multiplayer shoot-'em-up drops players onto an island. They then fight against each other and the clock as the playing area gets smaller and smaller. It's free to play, but people spend real money upgrading their accounts with the way their characters look. They call them skins. They also buy accessories like paragliders, pickaxes, and victory dances. And that can make a player's account both valuable and a target for hackers. So who are these hackers, and how are they doing it? Well, it turns out they're pretty easy to find. Their adverts for stolen accounts are all over social media. There's an entire network of buyers, sellers and middlemen. They're all operating completely out in the open. Some of these hackers, or crackers as they call themselves, are children as young as 14. This is how they do it. Crackers buy huge lists of usernames and passwords that have been published online by other hackers who've carried out data breaches in the past. They use a tool to input them into the Fortnite login in bulk. When they get a successful hit, they take over the account and make it difficult, or even impossible, for the true owner to get access. Hi mate, can you hear me? Hello? Here's one of the game's most prolific hackers. He's from Slovenia, he's 17, and he agreed to speak to me, but only if we met inside the game. He let me see bank statements that show some of the accounts he sells can be worth hundreds of pounds. This, despite the accessories not giving a player any advantage in the game. We've had his words voiced by an actor.
I kind of understand why people would like these accounts, because it's always nice to have something that your friends don't have. Overall, I made €16,000. That would be a valid amount. For the Christmas break, I expect per week to make $2,000 at the minimum.
What you're doing is a crime, right? As we're chatting away, it becomes clear that I'm talking to one of the most hardcore crackers out there. He breaks into major databases to steal even more usernames and passwords. But the thing is, the authorities say they are watching, and they're worried that cracking is leading these young hackers into more serious cybercrime. Ethan Thomas is the youngest ever recruit for the UK's National Crime Agency. He's a gamer himself.
These individuals that think that they are anonymous may soon realise that they have one of these officers knocking on their door. Just the compromise of a Fortnite account could come under Section 1 of the Computer Misuse Act, which is up to 2 years in prison.
The National Crime Agency is asking game makers to do more to stop this kind of hacking taking place on their platforms. One thing they're reluctant to do, though, is encourage any technical changes. But we've spoken to hackers who've told us that their businesses would end overnight if the platform enforced two-factor authentication. This is where you attach your mobile phone to your account to prove who you are. Epic, the company behind Fortnite, hasn't commented on our investigation, but the game maker says it's working to improve security. It also encourages and rewards players who take steps to increase their account protection. In the meantime, the game's popularity grows daily, and the teenage hackers continue to make a killing.
Our cyber security reporter, Joe Tidy. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Till next time. Bye-bye.